What discriminations did you experience as a child?
I was fortunate that being born and raised in San Luis, really didn't face discrimination until I was probably in the 8th grade. So during the 8th grade, we had a nun, Sister Alice, who was one of our teachers, and she was very clear that we were not to speak Spanish in her class. So of course I ended up speaking Spanish and I ended up getting scolded, and that to me was probably my first dealings with discrimination in terms of speaking my own language. Well, there's several different things that are important in my culture. First of all, language, because language is the backbone of a culture, so that's very important. Other important aspects of my culture would be our connections to the land grant, the Sangre de Cristo land grant, and of course to our water, the acequias, because that's the lifeblood of this community. My traditions are a very important part of my culture, my way of living, gardening, again, dealing with the land and water. Those are all very important aspects of my culture.
What was the most important thing to you growing up?
One of the most important things for me growing up in this community was being able to go up on the sierra and just enjoy it up on the land grant. We were able to go up and hunt and fish and picnic and camp, gather our medicinal herbs. We were able to graze. More importantly, we were able to go up there and gather firewood and latias and other types of wood for the constructions in our home. So to me, being up on the sierra are some of the most fondest memories that I have growing up in this community. Well, family values, to me, I'm a mother of 4 daughters, so values in my community are definitely education. Education is extremely important to me and my children, my grandchildren. Speaking our own language, following in the traditions that I grew up in and passing those down to my children. The food that we eat, the holidays and the way we celebrate them. We typically don't do 4th of July, but we will do Mexican Independence Day. We celebrate Cinco de Mayo. Those are all values that were instilled in me as a child that I passed down to my children and that my children are passing down to them. So anything that makes up my culture, whether it's surface culture or deep culture, that's very important to me as a mother and a grandmother and as an educator. I think the biggest struggle that existed in this community when I was growing up was the lack of access to the land grant. I grew up in the 60s and the 70s, and by that time, access to the land grant had been taken away. The fence was already put up and none of us were allowed to go there. So that has been a struggle that I have been involved in all of my life, and it's still a struggle today. Other struggles we had in this community when I was growing up was the lack of resources, which we still have that same issue in this community. However, we have individuals who are now addressing those particular issues. There was a lack of social interactions. What I mean by that was there was no community center, there were no bowling alleys, there was one movie theater. So there was really a lack of things for young people to do in this community, and that still exists today. However, I think that the problem is worse today than it was when I was growing up, because when I was growing up, we found things to do in the community, and today those things, you can't do those things. For example, we had bonfires just about every weekend and kids gathered and it was just a place to be. You can't do that anymore because of the dangers of the fire hazards, which I understand safety. So many of the issues that existed when I was growing up still exist today. Well, I think the drug issues in this community have certainly been exacerbated to the point where we have young people who are now involved in the hard drugs like the heroin, the crack, the cocaine. That was never an issue for me when I was growing up. Those drugs were around, but they were not in, we were not exposed to them as teenagers. We were not exposed to those hard drugs. And today that particular issue is rampant in our community. So in that sense, things have gotten worse. I think the fact that we don't have access to the sierra, there's no type of recreation, which is where we found it, was up on the sierra. Anything we did for recreation was there. So not having access to our land grant to the sierra makes kids go and do things that are not positive and end up getting in trouble with the law, and then that takes them down a whole other road. So I think in terms of problems among our youth, I think they're worse today than they were when I was a teenager in this community.
So why isn't the Spanish language carried on to this generation?
Well, I think that our language was lost not with your generation, but with a previous generation, and even with my generation. I'm very fortunate that I'm bilingual. That's one of the greatest assets that I have, that I can speak and write and communicate both in Spanish and in English. And I truly believe that the main reason that your generation and your parents' generation no longer speak Spanish is because we were made to be ashamed of speaking the Spanish language. In this country, it's so different from the rest of the world. In this country, what is promoted is monolingualism, which is you speak English and only English because that is supposed to be the official language of this country. However, in the other parts of the world, if you are a bilingual person or a trilingual person, someone who can speak more than 1 or 2 or 3 languages, you are considered a very intelligent person and a very resourceful person because there are more than one language that's spoken in the world. However, in this country, because of the racism that exists, we lost that. Let me give you an example. Many of our parents didn't teach us Spanish because they didn't want us to suffer. The example that I gave earlier about the nun that would punish me, that would embarrass me, that would put me in the corner or send me home or call my parents to tell them I was a bad student, which I wasn't, all because I spoke Spanish, made you feel inferior, made you feel like you were less than. They made you feel like if you were someone who spoke Spanish, that you were dumb, that you were stupid. Well, it's quite the opposite. I've learned as an adult that the individual who can speak more than one language is worth the position of 2 people. Very true. So we were made to feel bad about speaking Spanish. We were punished. So parents stopped teaching us Spanish because they didn't want their kids to suffer, not knowing that by doing that, again, language is the backbone of a culture. When you take away a person's language, I compare it to a jellyfish. If you pull out the back of a jellyfish, you're just a jellyfish. You're out there, you don't have a backbone. And it's the same thing for those of us, for anybody that has lost their language. If you lose your language, then you start to lose the rest of your identity, your culture, your traditions, your foods, and you want to become like the macro culture, like the big culture in this country. So one of the worst things that ever happened to our people was that we lost that language. However, I don't think it's too late. Again, a person who can speak 2 languages is going to earn twice as much money in any profession. They're going to be valued as 2 individuals because you can communicate in 2 different languages, so you can go all over the world. And in particularly language, many of us believe that English is the #1 language spoken in the world when it's not. It's really Spanish. So it's to our advantage to start teaching our kids. The other reason that we lost our language is because schools don't teach Spanish. And if they do teach it, it's Castilian Spanish, Spanish that is taught and used in Spain. That's not our dialect of Spanish. So kids are disinterested. Even those kids that are fluent in Spanish will not take the Spanish classes at the high school because it's not the Spanish that they are fluent in, so they end up not passing those classes. They end up flunking those classes. So again, you're made to feel like my language isn't good enough. So I put the blame both on our families who did it to protect you, but I really put the blame on public education that doesn't value a person being bilingual, or at least they didn't in my generation, and it still holds true for your generation. If schools really wanted to make an impact, they would start teaching kids from kindergarten all the way through high school, so you could actually come out being able to speak, write, and read Spanish, our dialect of Spanish. So there's plenty of blame to be passed around. However, I'm very optimistic that there's still a way to recapture our language, but we've got to work in partnership with our families and more importantly with our schools to be able to teach those kids, because once they graduate and they're fluent in 2 languages, those particular students can be successful in any career that they choose as an adult. So it's important to learn your language. Well, when I was growing up in this community, I was raised by a single mother who was a lunchroom cook for many decades. I had 3 older brothers and a younger sister. I'm the oldest of the girls. When I was growing up in this community, if I was out on the streets doing anything that I shouldn't be doing, any adult, whether they were related to me or not, could go and tell my parents, hey, Shirley was doing this, or they could go and, what the kids call, they could go and snitch on me. But today that doesn't happen. As an individual who has worked on dropout prevention, I have done many thousands of home visits. And what I find different today is when I do a home visit in this community, instead of, not all parents, but there is a percentage of parents who will, instead of thanking me for coming and telling them that their kid is failing or doing something wrong in the community, they'll tell you, well, that's really not your business, that's my kid. See, it was different before. Any adult could come and mentor me. Any adult could come and tell me, hey, you're doing this and it's wrong, I'm going to go and tell your parents. You try to do that to parents and they're not very welcoming. It's like, hey, that's my kid, it's my business, you stay out of it. So that's a big change. I believe in the concept that it takes a village to raise a child. I still believe that. And it still holds true today. However, because of parenting skills, or the lack of parenting skills, I should say, parents aren't very welcoming with that. So I still believe that it takes a village to raise a child, and because the influences, the negative influences out in the community, that verbiage holds even more true today. So things have really changed, but like I said, I'm still very positive. We have very good kids in this community, and with good programs and good role modeling and good mentoring, we could go back to the days when I was a young person, and that is that every adult in the community cares about the kids and gets involved with the kids so that the kids can have a successful career, whether they choose to stay in San Luis or whether they choose to go out in the real world. You still need those life skills to be able to be a good, productive, caring, and giving adult.
Why is the cultural land important to you?
Well, culture is what gives you your identity. My language, the color of my skin, my accent, the way I live my life, the foods that I eat, the holidays that I celebrate, my political thoughts, that is my culture. Culture is the way you think, feel, and act. So if I didn't have my culture, how would I think? How would I feel? How would I act? So my culture gives me a true sense of identity, and it's even more important because I am a woman and I am a woman of color. So for me, culture is important because it gives me 100% of my identity. I love this community. You know, I was born and raised in this community, and I have very good, fond memories. There are good people in this community. I love the community. I love the people. But what really drew me back to this community was 2 things: the youth and the land grant issue. I have been involved in the land grant issue since I was 20 years old. So for the last 40 years, the land grant issue has consumed my life. Getting access to that land grant, getting access for your generation is very, very, very important to me, because it's that mountain that sustains this community. This community wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the resources on that mountain. And that legal case, that struggle is still ongoing, so I still want to be a part of it. And I also came back because my background is in dropout prevention, and I'm an ethnic studies teacher. I have been for more than 2 decades. So coming back to this community, every summer I would come back, and then once a month to do my land grant meetings. You know, you notice what's happening with the kids. You notice the deterioration in your community. I have hope in youth. I always have. It is your generation that is going to create the positive or negative changes in this world, in this state, in this country, in this community. So when I look at the kids in this community and I see the lack of things to do, I see the lack of resources, I see the lack of positive programs that are going to make your generation good, productive citizens, I wanted to be a part of that. I have the skills and the knowledge to work with young people, and I'm still mobile and somewhat sane, although some people might argue that. I wanted to come back and really give back to this community because I see the untapped potential that exists in this community. There are youth in this community that have so much talent and skills, but it goes unnoticed, it goes untapped. I wanted to be a change agent in this community. I wanted to come back and give of my time, my effort, but more important, of my knowledge, so that our kids could become successful young people that would go on to college or do whatever it is that they wanted to do after high school. I want every kid to have the opportunity that I had in my life. So that's the reason that I'm back in this community. I want to create change.